So, right, good morning, everyone. It's great to have you here for another MESHWORK webinar. I'm really excited for this one. So we've got Jan Stannard from Rewilding. So it's a very new company. I think you launched within COVID times, but they're doing some really amazing things. So definitely jump onto their website and their Instagram to check out all the rewilding projects they're helping out and all the educational stuff they're doing as well. The reason why we've brought Rewilding into the sustainable design platform is because so much is focused on carbon, and what we're really trying to do now is expand the conversation and bring nature into it. We've got biodiversity net gain, but that is only 10%. So what we're really hoping is for you guys to learn the basic principles of rewilding and then bring them into your design process. So think about them at the beginning, and then hopefully by the end your building will sit within a great wildlife structure as well. So yeah, it's really exciting. It's going to be really interesting and a little bit different to what we normally do. So I'm just going to go over some housekeeping. Please leave your microphones on mute so that the presentation runs really smoothly. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat box. We can go through them all at the end. And if there's one you want to ask in person, just let me know and just unmute yourself and ask it at the end as well. So we'll go through all of those as well. And the webinar will be recorded and will appear on our YouTube channel and within the MESHWORK community as well. So for those of you who don't know what MESHWORK is a sustainable design community. We're really here to help facilitate education between our members, and we're doing this by having webinars like today. We've got networking events coming up. We've introduced lunch and learns, and through having MESHWORK specialists. So we've got a few people joining who are here to develop blogs for you guys so you can learn and engage with them in the comments below. So we're doing a lot of things are changing as well, so keep your eyes peeled to what we do next. MESHWORK is also connected to Mesh Energy. So Mesh Energy is an independent and holistic energy consultancy. It's primarily based in Surrey but works on projects all across the UK and the globe. We mainly work with design teams and architects to make the sustainable design process as simple and as cost-effective as possible. But anyway, that is enough from me. I will now pass on to Jan and she'll go over her presentation.
Thank you very much. And I am going to share my screen, making sure I get the right one. So is that the right screen? Just to double check. Great.
Yes, it is.
So hello to everyone in the webinar now, and to those of you who pick this up afterwards. Really interested to be here to help explain more about rewilding and how it differs from conservation, which I'm sure all of you will be very familiar with, and to tell you about what HEAL is working on. So I'm aiming to talk for about 40 minutes and then happy to take questions. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on why I'm doing the thing I'm doing, because I'm the chair of trustees of HEAL. I'm not paid in my role, but I work more than 5 days a week doing it. And it's all come from this passion produced as a result of the crisis that we're facing with nature. So let me, many of you will know that nature isn't doing too well in this country, but I think a lot of people don't really realize just how bad it is. So there is this international ranking of how countries are doing for the state of their nature, and we are 189th in terms of how healthy our nature is, which, put a different way, means that 233 places, countries and territories are outperforming England. I mean, what else were we that bad at? And part of the issue is this where you go out and you're used to what you see and you don't know what went before. So it's called shifting baseline. So you'll go out and see lovely green fields and think, gosh, it looks great. But actually what you're seeing is absence and not presence, because we have a problem with extinction. We have a problem with decline. 41% of species are in decline, birds are in decline, insect populations, which is particularly worrying, are in decline. So we have this huge crisis. And I've loved nature my whole life, and I'm now more than 3 decades into a business career, and I've now reached an age and stage where I was able to think, okay, rather than continuing with my business life, how could I make a difference to this crisis? And yeah, so read various books, saw various reports, and thought the answer is to set up a charity. And I'll talk about HEAL towards the end, but essentially we are set up as the UK's first rewilding landowner charity, triggered by this nature crisis. And let's look at the habitat crisis. So we don't have, the animals aren't thriving because the habitats aren't there anymore. So wetlands, huge loss in wetlands. Imagine a quarter of Britain was once wet. It makes you realize how much the land has been drained in that time. Wildflower meadows, so few left, just fragments of wildflower meadows. Ponds, 1 million ponds have gone. Allotments are now much more healthy in terms of their soil than arable fields. Huge amounts of ancient woodlands lost. And we've got somewhere close to where I'm talking to you from, which is in the Thames Valley in Maidenhead. We've got somewhere near here that's been unimproved since 1597, when Elizabeth I gave it a special status. And that makes you realize how rare those places are. It's really rare because we are such a densely populated country with a lot of change to our land use, and obviously a lot of urban development and industrial site development, which many of you will have been involved in. And our woodland cover is much less than Europe, but it is going up. So that is a sort of sign of good news. So, and it's not just nature and habitats, but it's also the climate crisis. And in this presentation, I'll talk a bit about why rewilding helps not just nature, but also the climate. But one of the things that we have picked up, so we've been going since March 2020, we've operated entirely through the pandemic, which as a charity is quite a challenge, but we've done exceptionally well because people have this real sense of the problem. People understand conservation, and they possibly heard the word rewilding, and they know that both help nature, but a lot of people don't understand the difference. And there is a profound philosophical difference between the two. And what I want you to leave this talk understanding is what's the difference, and why is there so much talk about rewilding, and how does it fit in with the kinds of projects that you will be talking about? Because any change to any environment, built or not, can have a positive effect or a negative effect on nature and biodiversity. But let's look at what the difference is between these two things. So nature conservation is about saving something that's there, about saving an environment. And here's a beautiful, what I think is a chalk downland. So this is something that is often actively managed by conservation organizations. Sand dune conservation, so you're conserving particular habitats, so you might want to conserve these for lizards perhaps, or a particular type of plant that thrives in sand dunes. And conservation also involves creation of habitat. So a good example, and this photograph is from if you haven't heard of the cell bunting, it's a little bird which has had a catastrophic drop. But by creating special environments for this bird, they have significant increase in numbers. So you can preserve it, you can create it, and then you can manage it. So here's an example of a woodland that's been coppiced. So this is where teams of conservation volunteers will get their chainsaws out and their, I was going to say axes, their loppers out, and will make these kinds of changes. And as you'll see in a minute, what's really interesting, the connection between the way that conservation organizations have worked and what rewilding is doing, you'll begin to see the connections between the two. So that's a really short summary of what conservation is, but what you've got to remember is they protect what's left. That's the really key thing. So how has protecting what's left, and also some creation of new sites, how's that been? And this will give you the idea. So since 1970, when we've had brilliant conservation organizations doing masses of work across the country, this is what's happened. So you've seen this continuing drop. So what became apparent to many was that conserving what's there is not enough anymore. That has to carry on, but we need something new. And that's where rewilding really became something that people paid attention to. So what we need is more wild places where nature can thrive, but run in a particular way. And that's by nature. And I'll come on and talk a bit. You'll understand what we mean by that as I go through it. But that is a distinct difference. So with conservation, it's man or person managed. In rewilding, it's nature managed. And one of the things that at HEAL we try not to get sucked into is a debate about definitions, but that doesn't mean to say that the science isn't important. Different people are always on a spectrum. I'm sure that happens in your communities. There are people who are purists who see things very much in black and white terms, and there are others who see complexity and see the greys. But what's most important is that whether it's conservation or rewilding, science should underpin it, and good ecology, and making sure that you don't do things that have unwelcome consequences. So the thing about rewilding is you can think of it as a sort of holistic approach. It's a big picture approach to looking after how nature does. And you're going to start to get a clue, if you don't already know this, that cattle are involved. And again, we'll come on and talk about why that is. But clearly, for a community of people to adopt rewilding as an approach, it has to work. So how do we know that rewilding works? So you've got these new places for nature where we're using this method, which I'll explain shortly, but how do we know it works? Well, here is some amazing evidence from an estate in Sussex called Knepp. It's huge, it's 3,500 acres, but they concentrate their rewilding work mainly in a 1,000-acre area. And this place is very close to dual carriageways, it's close to Gatwick. It's got intensively farmed farmland all around it, but they stopped farming because they were essentially, their inputs were costing a fortune, and they stopped farming completely in 2004, and they have been a rewilding site. And their results are extraordinary. So anyone interested in biodiversity gain, look at these results, they're absolutely amazing. So they've had huge increases in bird species. Turtle doves used to be everywhere in Britain. Nobody ever sees them or hears them. Nightingales galore. If you go to Knepp at the right time, you'll always hear a nightingale. Extraordinary number of species of butterfly. The biggest site for purple emperors, which is this beautiful butterfly you can see, the purple one top right. They've seen more of lesser whitethroat and black caps. There are two types of bird in 6 weeks, in 30 years. 13 species of bats. I mean, who knew there were 13? I mean, I know, but you may not know there are 13 species. And I think they've got all but one or two rare birds on site. And the organic carbon of their rewilded areas has doubled. So if you look at an arable control, they've doubled their organic carbon. And obviously for climate change action, that's really key. Huge numbers of invertebrates, lots more than they've recorded, and their bank voles have doubled. You think, why is that key? Well, of course, bank voles are part of the food web. They're eaten by owls and raptors, and all of these species are all about the lower orders, the insects and so on, feeding the ones above and the ones above, and you'll have all done that at school, I'm sure, but it's a really key point. For those of you in the audience who already know a bit about rewilding, the amazing work at Knepp was documented by the wife of the owner of Knepp, Isabella Tree. Great name. Who'd have guessed? Who'd have guessed? What a better name could you have than Isabella Tree? And interestingly, if you open and read the first paragraph of Wilding, Ted Green is mentioned, who is one of the country's foremost experts on ancient trees. And he'd been called into net by Isabella Tree and her husband, Charlie Burrell, Sir Charles Burrell, to look at some very old oak trees that were not thriving. And the conversation that Charlie and Izzy had with Ted started them on this process of looking at how their nature was doing and really paying attention to it. So if you haven't read Wilding, it's an absolutely uplifting read and has been the engine almost globally actually for the interest in rewilding as a topic. So I'm now going to start deep diving into what rewilding is. And the first thing to say is it originated in the early 1990s in the US, and it's taken a different shape in different continents. So America sees it, which has a lot of wilderness, sees in a particular way. Europe does it slightly differently because we're more densely populated, many of our areas. In Britain, it's pretty similar as in some parts of Europe, but we don't have that sort of unspoilt wilderness, which they absolutely have in the States. So we mean something slightly different, but what we can say is there are principles behind rewilding, and Heal shares those, as does anyone actually who's interested in it. And with your whatever line of work you're in, just think about how you can connect some of these principles into the work that you're doing, because there will be connections. So providing hope and purpose. So if you're designing a new housing estate where you've got the 10% net gain now to look at, and you're able to deliver that on site, don't forget what an amazing effect it can have on people to see a butterfly, or to see bees, or to see other small creatures in the area. So perhaps crickets. We have crickets in a town garden. You know, there are amazing things that can happen in urban areas, and that emotional connection is really critical for people, particularly for their mental health. It has made a real difference to people. So offering natural solutions to humanity's problems, and that's what we'll cover today. So the main problem is climate change, and rewilding helps in several ways, which I'll cover. It enables people to think creatively. It's one of those because it triggers an emotional reaction to people, not just a scientific reaction to people. They often have quite creative ideas about how they'll make things work. It's complementary to conservation, no question. Nature leads, I've said that, and you work at nature scale. So I will, before the end, talk about where you can rewild. And there's no question that the best results are gained at the greatest scale. And the main reason is that we are a top predator, and if we're not there, nature thrives. And the best example of that in Europe is Chernobyl. So because it's a nuclear exclusion zone, wildlife has absolutely exploded in terms of types, and they're doing well. They don't seem to be affected by the nuclear fallout, which is extraordinary. But scale is key. And I'll talk a bit about Heal scale. And people are key. So some people think that rewilding means the clearances. Well, it doesn't. There is really good evidence that where an area of the countryside is rewilded, the numbers of jobs increase. And if it's publicly accessible, which our rewilding sites will be, then we can share those experiences with the general public. So, and a link here is that rewilding builds nature-based economies. So it's about building people who are looking at sustainable building in the countryside, for example, which some of you will be. That could be seen as a nature-based economy because you're doing something that helps biodiversity and the climate. And small businesses, perhaps, who are on sites, who are producing sustainable goods. So all these sorts of things happen, but the main economies that I think rewilding will, or the main economy which will be relevant for this audience, is the biodiversity net gain, because rewilding sites can provide off-site mitigation or off-site gains for projects. Acting in context, this is about the science, that every site's different, so you see what there is and you act accordingly. Working together, it's an amazingly collaborative endeavour. So when we launched on the 30th of March 2020, so we're just coming up for our second birthday, we planned for about 12 volunteers. We thought we're a tiny, no one's heard of us, a tiny charity, and we put stuff out on, there's one article in The Guardian and some social media coverage, and we had 170 volunteers write to us within about 10 days, and we were literally swamped. People love the fact that they're not only making a difference, but they're being with like-minded people. So what you'll find, and in fact, this is true generally of working in the environment and conservation as well, is that people love the fact that they work collaboratively, and knowledge exchange. And I think, for me, this is an example of knowledge exchange. So I'm exchanging knowledge about rewilding and conservation with you who are in a different sector, but there will be crossovers. And those, I didn't say this, but those are principles at a European level. The other thing to say is that there is an international standards body that also has principles to rewilding. So this is anchored in good science. And this was the original thinking from the American sort of early 1990s. But it was originally called cores, corridors and carnivores, because one of the ways of looking at how nature runs an area is to have top predators back. We don't have them in the UK. I'll come on to that. But so this is the European version of this, or certainly the British version of this. So you're looking for core areas of nature recovery with corridors in between. And this is where when you're doing, if you're doing a building project, perhaps it's on a campus, so you've got you might have pods of buildings with space between them, thinking about how you can create linear corridors, whether it's hedging corridors, wildflower, strips of wildflowers linking buildings, whether you have tunnels under roads. Those are all things that enable wildlife to move around the landscape and transit safely. So although this is a rural concept, this is, your cores could be buildings, but you could have the corridors between. So that's a connection to many of you who will be listening. So let's have a quick look about what rewilding is. So this is quite a technical definition, but you're a relatively technical audience. So it's the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. I find allowed an interesting word, but that's the Rewilding Britain definition. So it takes account of the whole thing, and it focuses on the recovery of all of it rather than a single species or a single habitat. So it's not about planting a wood. It's not about creating a habitat for a bunting. It's about the whole piece. And one of the realities of taking a piece of land that's depleted and restoring it for nature, because most rewilding sites will not have anything special in them, is that there are things missing, and they're missing because of human activity. And in order for nature to thrive, you have to look at if those things need to be put back, and they often do in this country particularly. So what are the natural processes that could be missing? So the water cycle's one. So if a field has been drained, we would stop that drainage up. We would allow the land to flood again, or beavers would arrive or be introduced, and they would put dams in place. So again, thinking about developments where perhaps you would be given a brief for a waterside development, well, canalized edges don't support the water cycle. You know, there are surfacing streams, and making them wiggle is now the way that people are trying to approach water. So all of the, and also I'll just mention it while I'm here, you know, kingfishers cannot nest where there are solid banks and so on. So there are lots of changes where water can make a difference. The way that oxygen is formed. So, you know, are there enough trees and plants to produce oxygen, and what's missing in terms of species? And then once those components are in place, it's called self-willed nature. So nature knows what it's doing. We're part of nature. We are a species. Nature's been doing this for millennia. It knows what it's doing. It doesn't. It's some say it's kind of fairly high-handed of us to think that we can help nature better than nature can help itself, because it knows what it's doing. So self-willed nature. And the reason that we want these key species are because they do things in the landscape. They trample, they wallow, they tear stuff off, they essentially disturb the landscape. So disturbance is a really key point. And this is a wonderful illustration that we found, that it's obviously packed with creatures, and I'm sure it would never have been like this, but it makes you think about, so I'm sitting in the Thames Valley, and I know there were those, I think they're called long-tusked elephants, but those, or straight-tusked elephants, those elephants in the background were where I'm sitting. Rhinoceroses were where I'm sitting. Hippopotamuses were where I'm sitting. So we are in a landscape that had a lot of disturbance from animals before we came along. And clearly most of those are lost, but disturbance is a really key idea. So what does that mean, disturbance? Well, it means that when rewilding projects are established, you want to think about what is there in the landscape that's going to be able to disturb it. We don't want us in there because we're a top predator. We're not going to have wolves because we're a highly populated area, and possibly one day in Scotland. I won't be alive to see it, I don't think, but these are the kinds of large animals that do disturb. So when you're looking at a rewilding project at the size of NEP and the sort of size that HEAL will have, you're talking about browsers. So these are the animals that browse at tree level, and actually cattle do that to some extent too, but roe deer, which are native, red deer, which are native, they're kind of halfway, they'll browse and they'll graze. Fallow deer are introduced, but most people sort of consider them native, certainly NEP have fallow deer. And then you've got the grazers, and cows and horses eat in different ways. So they disturb the ground, they paw the ground, they wallow, they create these areas of bare earth. And then pigs, which are amazing, and clearly wild boar are present in some areas, but what pigs do is rootal. They use their snouts, these extraordinary plows really, and plow up the land and find out what's underneath. So here are a suite, these are often called the rewilding suite of large animals, and many rewilding projects will look to introduce the three on the right, and also, if not, they will probably have some of the three deer species. If not, they may introduce them. So here are the Longhorn Cattle at NEP. They are matriarchal herds. Their behavior is completely different from if they were kept as kept animals. There is a new term called kept wild, which means that they are proxies for their ancient wild ancestors. These are pretty docile. They give birth very easily, naturally. It's an amazing herd, and HEAL plans to have these cattle too. Here are some Exmoor ponies grazing in a long grass landscape. Lots of projects have Exmoor ponies or other similar, sometimes conic ponies. And here are Tamworth pigs. So have a look at this. Can you see? This is an amazing photograph. These pigs have rootled in this line. Why would a pig only rootle in the middle of a field? The reason is that the fields either side have been improved, whereas the strip they're on is an ancient trackway which has never been ploughed. And that is the healthiest place. So that has creatures in it that they can dig up. They're omnivores, so they eat beetles and so on, as well as plants and roots. So these guys, so clever, they know where their food is, and they've disregarded the places either side, because this is like their table of chocolate. Here's a magnificent red deer. Here's a fallow. And then here's a species that I'm sure you'll have seen in the news. Beavers were all over the UK. There were millions of them in every waterway, and they died out, there's some debate, but around 400 years ago. But there have been some unofficial introductions, and they are now being licensed to be in enclosures. And essentially the population of wild and enclosed beavers is growing quite quickly. And the reason beavers are key is because they affect they have a major effect for their size on the landscape around them. And they create pools, and those pools support all kinds of amphibians and insects like dragonflies, and fish species are supported. And beavers don't eat fish, despite what you might know from reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I think that's the one, yeah. They don't eat fish. They are plant eaters. They're rodents, actually. And they don't stop fish from traveling upstreams like salmon. They grew up with salmon for millennia. So they're a wonderful species. Storks have been reintroduced at NEP. That's a significant species. And this year, bison, European bison, are being reintroduced to this country, which is an extraordinary project in Kent. And then some people want Dalmatian pelicans to come back. Some people want lynx back. And that could happen in Scotland. They're very shy, but that's a top predator. So that would help keep deer populations under control. And then wolves, unlikely, but certainly on the continent, they're on the border, they're on the channel, they're at the Channel now, wolves, and they can't come to us because there's no land bridge, but they're as close as they can get at the moment. And the one animal you won't have seen, a sheep, is a sheep. And the reason is that those of you who remember your physics, the weight of the body of a sheep goes down that tiny leg onto that tiny hoof, puts a lot of pressure on the ground, and it compacts it. And they leave a bowling green behind. So the landscape you can see behind that sheep is a depleted landscape, very, very little biodiversity. And so generally speaking, you won't see sheep in rewilding projects. So that's the explanation of what rewilding is. I could talk for hours about this, but that's the essence of it. So next, let's come and look at, so you can see that rewilding helps biodiversity, but how does it help climate change? There are 4 ways, and a lot of people know only one of these. The first one is that it heals the land, so it makes everything healthier and more able to be resilient, particularly. So with climate change affecting where species are able to thrive, making those species as healthy as possible is critical. It's like if your immune system is in tip-top condition, you are going to be able to be in better shape to fight off anything that might come at you. Growth, this is the one that most people understand. So they know that if you leave a piece of land, a garden, the land around a solar farm, around an industrial estate, or in the rural areas, if you leave that, plants grow. That's what nature does. It covers bare areas and it grows, and that captures carbon. So, and it captures it down through the plants and it's held in the ground. And that is the reason why people are talking about tree planting. But trees, woodland, there are only 3 species of birds that live in woodlands. Woodlands are not very biodiverse. So the issue with tree planting is it will, that's why rewilding is not about planting trees. It doesn't exclude planting trees, but it's not about wholesale tree planting. The third way in which rewilding helps climate change is it protects stores of soil carbon. So if those areas are being ploughed or excavated for building development, which some of you will well, I'm sure will be involved in, every time you plough up the ground, you not only destroy the soil structure, unavoidably, but you will also release carbon in doing that. And then prevention. So you're preventing the continuation of uses of things that will produce greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide if it's being used intensively. So there are the 4 ways in which rewilding makes a difference. And then landscapes. One of the things that you have to get used to is that rewilding doesn't end up looking like this gorgeous chocolate box scene, which I love, which we all grow up with. It's very different. And this is what a rewilded landscape looks like. It's, it's messy, it's random. Here's another one, and another. So this is what happens, and we use NEP because they're such brilliant examples. On the left, a field, on the right, same field. Now, people see the field on the right and say it's untidy, but nature is random. It is untidy. It loves untidiness. And that's going to be quite a challenge if you're somebody who produces clean lined environments, who likes to see things in neat and tidy areas. And it's a real tough job for educating the public or the residents of a building. You know, how do you help them to understand that if you leave dead plants over the winter, that is the home for insects and their eggs for the next season. So that is that species homes, and if you take them down, you remove their homes. So it's a big shift, but just remember, nature is random, and that's really key. So here are some new words. Frowsy is definitely my favorite. So where can you rewild? Clearly I've talked about scale, and we are often asked, can I rewild in a garden? Well, if you're not purist about your definitions, you can deploy some of the principles, but let's just look at the scale question. If you've got a small area, left-hand side, you need a high level of management. So even if you're rewilding, you will still need to go in there and do conservation type techniques, because the land needs to be disturbed, things need to be broken off, things need to be crushed, things need to be rootled. So you can't get away with some people say, I've bought a field and I've walked away. Well, that field, unless there are deer and other species, that field will be in stasis. And I'm sure most of you know what that means. Nothing will happen. And I've seen that on Twitter. Somebody put a picture up of a strip of land alongside a house, and they said, I've left this for 10 years, nothing's happened. Well, the reason is that it's a thick thatch of grass and nothing will happen. That needed disturbing. And then the bigger the area, the more you can bring in herbivores and omnivores to do the work for you. And then on the very right hand side are the massive areas where you would get herbivores managed by carnivores. You get the complete sort of system. So that's my whistle stop tour, and I've got a few minutes to tell you about HEAL, so I shall crack through that now. Really simple mission: be the first rewilding landowner. So our mission is to raise money, buy land and rewild it, and we're registered as a charity in the UK. We are active in England, and the reason is that there's a lot of rewilding happening, and one of our core drivers is to be near big urban populations, so that people in cities can experience nature, because it's so important for people to have access to it. So our vision as a charity is huge, which is a rewilding site in every English county. I will not live to see that. But when we were, so I'm one of the co-founders, and when we were coming up with the idea of HEAL, we thought of the National Trust, which was started by a few ladies, probably with hats and nice cups of tea, who decided that they would set something up by saving a house. Same with RSPB. They were small groups that started, and they're still going, and they've achieved amazing things. So we had a really big vision, which is inspiring. And each of our sites will not just restore biodiversity, but capture carbon and reconnect people with nature. And our business plan will make each site self-sufficient. So we are buying land, because if you own the land, you can control what happens on it. So our sites will be owned by the charity in perpetuity. So it's not a nature conservation, it's biodiversity, carbon and well-being, and restoring natural processes and connected with others. So thinking about the cores and the corridors. So we are on track to acquire our first site this year. So the funding's in place, but the number of possible sites to buy has been really small. We've identified 8 counties between Somerset and Kent inclusive, where we will aim to buy our first site. So we are, it's not within our control. We're waiting for things to come onto the market, and everyone expects this spring to be better for all kinds of reasons, which I won't go into, but essentially we expect to buy somewhere this year, and that's what we've got, tens of thousands of supporters, and that's what they expect too. And our second site will be in the north, and we didn't want to be southist about it. We wanted to sort of take a BBC approach and say we'd go for one of the northern counties like Yorkshire or Lancashire or Northumberland for our second site. And we're going for this sort of size so that we can have these ecosystem engineers in. And we want to ideally be near other areas which are nature friendly or nature friendly farms or other nature areas. And we want depleted land because otherwise we have to do special things to look after the special habitats and species. And we expect the sites within 20 years to have this mix of 30% grass, 30% scrub. By scrub, we mean hawthorn, blackthorn, bramble, wild rose, all those thorny species which are so vital for conservation, which farmers have been paid to take up, unfortunately. 30% woodland and 10% bare land, wetland or other. So that gives you a kind of temporal view. And who sits behind HEAL? Well, I'm one of the founding trustees. And day to day, I work with my colleague Hannah Needham. And then we have 5 other trustees, and we're not diverse yet as a trustee board, but we intend to diversify our trustee board with another appointment of someone from a minority ethnic background. But we do have a diverse youth panel of 10 people who have, we've run policies past them, we've run marketing ideas past them, we've run decisions past them, and they've been really helpful. And we now have, we now have over 240 volunteers. And because we don't have our first site yet, these volunteers are all helping with desk-based, a lot of them are helping with desk-based tasks through Slack. And this is our pièce de résistance, really, which is that we're using What 3 Words to help connect people to sponsored land. So you can sponsor a square of land, and when we acquire the site, we will, it's £20 for a square, plus gift aid if people are eligible, and we will give people a What 3 Words address for their piece of land. Really, really popular. We've got thousands of people who've done this, and that's wonderful because we don't have a site yet, so we are blown away by people's willingness to support our mission in anticipation of our first site coming. Oh, the other thing to say is that you can program a drone. So if you don't know what 3 Words is, it's an addressing system. So it identifies a very small, so you're sitting on a What 3 Words address, 3 meters by 3 meters. They have 3 words. Hertfordshire isn't in our search area, but here's a good example. And you can program a drone to photograph, to lock onto a What 3 Words address, which means that we can photograph squares of people. And we'll also train volunteers to survey squares as well. And this is our vision for what we're going to be doing. So we had this done by a wonderful artist. So for the artistic amongst you, you'll love this, but this has got over 30 species, and it kind of goes from grey brown to green. Okay, so that's us. We wanted to form an organisation which would be a sort of linchpin for anyone, individual or company, who would who wants to take action for nature and be really, really practical. So if any of you are in companies, one of the things that we offer is our HEAL 3x3 as employee benefits and rewards. So we have the employee square scheme, which could be of interest. But I hope that you found that talk stimulating, and you learn things you didn't know, and anything you can do to help nature where you are, the smallest thing can make a difference. And in your work, just factor it in. Just think about the fact that we are not alone as a species. We depend on this ecosystem all around us. So that's us. That's our website. We're on social media. There's our email. And if any of you want to get in touch afterwards, then that would be great. But I'll hand back. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jan. That was amazing. Really, really interesting. I'm sure we've all learned something new from it. We've got one question from Jane, and she said, it looks very much like what would be understood as waste ground. I'm assuming this was talking about one of the pictures of a rewilding site. Is there a problem with antisocial behaviour and fly tipping around these rewilding sites?
I think there's a problem with fly tipping everywhere. I think what Jane is probably saying is, because it looks like waste ground, people may dump. I don't know that there's any, I've never heard that, but it's a really interesting one. We're very aware of the issue, and it does to some extent depend upon access. So quite often dumping happens just outside a farm gate or to one side, I've noticed. But I can't say. I have no evidence, but that's a great point. I will take on board actually, and we'll sort of factor that one in.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I've got one. So you spoke a bit about biodiversity net gain. So that is obviously for a lot of architects and construction industry specialists, that's their biggest step to including nature into a project. Do you think biodiversity net gain goes far enough? Because it is only 10% of the land that is a new development that is given back. Do you think 10% is a bit too low, or the concept of it needs to be improved a little bit?
Getting to 10% in itself has been a huge piece of work for years, and we'd always say it's never enough, but you've got to think about the practicalities. To be honest, one of the interesting things about the mechanism is that at 10%, it will be really interesting to see if that, to what extent that's done on site and off site. So in some ways you could regard this as, I have no evidence that this is the case, but you could regard this as a toe in the water. So in other words, if 10% works, then why not 15? Why not 20? We'd love it to be more, but we have to be realistic. So the net gain overhead, I mean, I'm using that with a business hat on and thinking, putting myself in the shoes of a developer, that is an overhead, but and I think it's also important to think about the different ways in which a net gain requirement can arise. So I'm broadly going to say there are national infrastructure projects, things like HS2, Oxford and Cambridge Expressway, Heathrow Airport runways. That's very different from mandatory new housing. So the Heal Future panel of young people I mentioned, when we talked about whether we would take money from biodiversity net gain projects wanting to go off site, they said we definitely support housing because we need houses. We're young, we need the housing stock. So Heal is looking at if there are local housing mandated housing builds and there is money available and we are close by, one of our sites is close by, we would look at accepting net gain money potentially. Not finalized yet, but that's the general direction of travel. But we wouldn't look at infrastructure projects, and the reason is those are necessarily because of things like the routes they have to take, and I'm sure most people in this call know that a lot of ancient woodland was taken down for HS2. Our supporters, and I recognize a couple of names of people who would just go nuts if we took money that arose from precious woodlands being destroyed. We just couldn't do that. So the answer is it's never enough. But can I mention what I call monoculture mitigation while I'm doing this? So one of the things I'd love everybody in the audience to think about is what I'm terming, I've never heard it used by anybody else, but I'm calling it monoculture mitigation. In other words, if all of you put in a hawthorn hedge, that's monoculture. If all of you put in a small pond, that's a monoculture. So in other words, what we're talking about is habitats need a lot of variety. So it's no good always putting in a primrose. You've got to think about, there are thousands of plant species, really think about variety, because every single plant species, if it's native, has sometimes an insect will only have one plant species that supports it. So really be aware of not just accepting the bog standard list of 10 plants. Really think about that. So monoculture mitigation, you heard it here, possibly first, but I'd really like people to think about that.
Cool. No, that sounds good. It definitely makes sense. Variety is always best. All right, so we've got a few more. I've got one from Karen, and she said, would people be able to visit their squares?
Yes, so within reason. So we're going to allocate squares around the edges where there are paths, but what we can't do is have people walk across the land, because that's a lot of squares and you could get crowds of people and it would disturb the nature too much. So people will be able to see their squares on the What Three Words map. That will show them where it is, and you'd be able to stand on the path and look out and say, there's my square. And if we can find a sponsor for it, we will be developing an augmented reality app so that people will be able to point their iPhone and see where their square sits on the land. That said, being on your iPhone while in nature, not necessarily a good look, but it's different things please different people. But so the answer is visit is the definition of the word visit. So certainly be near and look out over, but not actually walk to unless it's right on the edge.
Brilliant. All right, so we've got one more question from Glenn. He said, I heard on the radio the other day about leaving trees fallen in storms where possible to help with improving natural biodiversity. Any comments? And then he said, where can information be found about which plant species are better for rewilding rather than just looking pretty?
Okay, so dead wood and plants. Somebody on Twitter said the other day, we should call it something other than dead wood, because dead wood sounds so unpromising, like, you know, you're dead, it doesn't have a purpose. Whereas actually, there is a saying something like a tree takes 500 years to grow and 500 years to die. And even when it's dead, it's, you know, literally would be turned to powder. So I suggested groundwood, rotwood, you know, something else, but that is the word dead wood. And the answer is it is an absolute haven for an unbelievable number of species, from fungi to insects to worms to beetles. It's incredibly valuable. So unless there is a practical reason, it's blocking a path, you know, in the way for some reason, if you can leave it, please leave it. And the other thing was about plants, native plants, any native plants, but not any native plants, in the sense that, I'll correct myself, there is a charity called Flora Locale, Flora, second word Locale. And Flora Locale's mission is to help people understand which native plants were common in their area. And it all depends upon the geology. So if the soil was one type, if it was chalky soil, it would be one type of plant. If it was clay, it will be another type. So you can't just, so there is the other thing, and I don't think I came up with this, but it's called sort of McDonald's flower meadow. So in other words, it's this idea that it's a kind of cookie cutter approach to plants, and that's absolutely not the way to go. If you're going to be high caliber teams, when you're thinking about places, when you're specifying for places, contacting Flora Locale about what really works in your area on your soil type is the absolute best standard job. Obviously, if your margins are small, that's going to be tricky, but you know, if you're developing in an area, you could very quickly get a roster of plants that would work. And the other people vital at the Wildlife Trust, they will have botanists who can tell you, even come and visit and help you with what could work on your site.
That's amazing. That's really, really interesting, particularly when people are looking to build in that 10% as well, making sure the plants they're actually choosing are going to positively affect the environment around them. I guess there's a thing as well with making sure, I know maybe not all, definitely not all garden centres, but there's been talks about plants having pesticides on already. So when people are planting them in the garden, that's having a negative effect. So making sure they haven't been treated with awful pesticides would probably help as well.
Yes, I mean, don't use pesticides in your garden. I've just had my glyphosate output tested. I shan't say more since it's lunchtime, but anyway, I've had my glyphosate, and I have a 1 nanomole glyphosate residue, and I eat mostly organic food and I'm vegetarian, so that was quite shocking to me. But yes, so don't use pesticides, absolutely critical. Don't dig in your garden, just plant plugs. If you're gonna got weeds, put cardboard down and compost on top, you know, don't dig. But yes, the other thing is peat. Please buy peat-free compost. Peat is formed at 1 millimeter a year, 1 millimeter a year, and it's being hoovered off the landscape, and it is literally unsustainable. Peat is one of the best environments for capturing carbon. If we're going to beat this flipping climate change issue, we cannot dig up peat bogs anymore. We have to leave them in situ and re-wet them. So please, please don't use a peat-based compost in any of your projects.
Brilliant. No, that's really useful. I think everyone's going to come away with some really useful principles that they can start implementing in future projects. So that's great. If there's no more questions, I will end the webinar here, but thank you so much, Jan. It's been really, really useful. I know we've all come away with like a great understanding of rewilding.
You're very welcome. And I forgot to say, don't forget that every little nook and cranny in a building, as long as it doesn't go into the building, can be a home for dozens of creatures. So please think about your nooks and crannies. But I'm so grateful for being asked. I hope you've enjoyed it. And yes, if anyone has any questions they didn't want to ask, or anyone watching this subsequently want to send, please do email or fill in our contact form on our website, rewilding.org.uk. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.